Welcome, story lovers. I'm your regular storyteller, here to help you drift into a peaceful sleep. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, share it, and subscribe for more stories that will help you drift off peacefully. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if there's any story you'd love to hear next, feel free to share it below. The first time Mark mentioned the room, I thought he was just being protective because of the neighborhood watch emails that had been circulating about a string of break-ins 3 towns over. It started with a floor plan spread out over the kitchen island, his finger tracing a dead space between the master bedroom and the guest bath that I hadn't realized was there. He called it a structural necessity, a reinforced sanctuary where we could go if the world outside ever became too loud or too dangerous, and at the time, his hand on my shoulder felt like a promise of safety. I didn't question the heavy steel door that arrived on a flatbed truck while I was at work, or why he insisted on installing the ventilation system himself, claiming that contractors couldn't be trusted with the proprietary details of our home security. For months, the sound of drilling and the scent of industrial adhesive became the background noise of our marriage, a low hum of preparation that I mistook for love. The room was finished on a Tuesday in late October, a windowless box of grey soundproofing and cold LED strips that Mark proudly showed me, pointing out the stocked shelves of canned water and the independent power supply that would keep us connected even if the grid failed. He gave me a key card that felt heavy and cold in my palm, and for a while I carried it in my purse like a lucky charm, a symbol of a man who cared enough to build a fortress for us. But the patterns began to shift shortly after the door was officially hung, starting with the rules he didn't call rules, just suggestions for our mutual well-being. He asked me to start sleeping in the safe room once a week to get used to the recycled air, then twice a week, citing the increasing frequency of sirens in the distance as a reason to stay hunkered down. I noticed that the sirens never seemed to get closer, and when I looked at the news, there were no reports of the chaos he described with such vivid intensity over dinner. He would talk about the fragility of glass and the way a human shadow looks when it's trying to be invisible, his voice a calm, rhythmic drone that made me feel like the outside world was a thin veil ready to tear at any moment. I started noticing small changes in the house, things that felt like experiments in perception. One morning I found that the windows in the living room had been fitted with subtle, reinforced shutters that only opened halfway, and when I asked him about it, he simply said the sun was damaging the upholstery. Every few days, a new camera appeared in a corner of the ceiling, a tiny black eye that followed me from the kitchen to the hallway, and Mark would spend hours in the safe room staring at the monitors, his face bathed in the blue light of our private surveillance. He told me he was looking for patterns in the way the wind moved the trees, looking for the hitch in the rhythm that signaled a person was lurking just out of sight. The air in the house started to feel heavy, like it was being compressed, and I found myself spending more time in the safe room just to be near him, even though the silence in there was so absolute it made my ears ring. It was during one of those long, silent evenings that I noticed the first inconsistency. Mark had left his phone on the charging pad, and a notification popped up, a motion alert from a camera labeled Back Perimeter. I looked at the monitor wall, but all the screens showed static or empty grass. When I checked the system log, I realized that the footage I was seeing on the main monitors was on a 30-minute loop, a perfect, peaceful recording of our backyard from a sunny afternoon 3 days ago. The real-time feed was hidden behind a password-protected layer that I couldn't access, and when Mark came back into the room, he moved with a sudden, fluid speed to flip his phone over, his smile never reaching his eyes as he asked me why I wasn't resting. He started locking the door from the inside during our practice sessions, the heavy thud of the bolts sliding into place, sounding less like security and more like a finality. He told me the air quality outside was dropping, that there were chemical smells drifting in from the industrial park, though I couldn't smell anything but the lavender soap I used. I began to feel a strange lethargy, a dullness in my limbs that made it hard to argue when he suggested we stay in the room for an entire weekend. He brought me meals on a tray, meticulously balanced and bland, and he watched me eat every bite with a clinical intensity that made my throat tighten. I found a scratch on the inside of the steel door, a thin, jagged line near the floor that looked like it had been made by a fingernail. And when I touched it, Mark caught my wrist, his grip just a fraction too tight, as he explained that the previous owners must have stored something sharp in that space. but there were no previous owners. We had built this house from the ground up. The questions started to pile up in the back of my mind like unread mail. Why did the ventilation system hum in a sequence of 3 long beats and 2 short ones? Why did Mark start wearing his shoes to bed? Why did the monitors sometimes show a figure standing by the oak tree that looked exactly like me, wearing the same yellow sweater I'd lost a month ago, only for the screen to flicker and show an empty yard a second later? I realized I hadn't seen my car in the driveway for a week, and when I asked Mark where it was, he said he'd taken it for an oil change, yet he never left the house for more than 10 minutes at a time. The safe room was becoming the only world I knew, a grey-walled universe where time was measured by the cycling of the LED lights. I woke up in the middle of the night to find Mark gone from the cot next to mine, the door standing slightly ajar. I crept out into the hallway, the floorboards cold against my bare feet, and followed a low murmur of voices coming from the kitchen. I expected to see the television, but the house was dark except for a single candle on the table. Mark was sitting there talking to the empty air, his voice a rhythmic, soothing whisper. He was saying my name over and over, followed by coordinates and dates, like he was reciting a ledger. He was telling the darkness that I was settling in well, that the acclimation process was almost complete, and that the vessel was holding steady. I retreated to the safe room, my heart hammering against my ribs, and pulled the heavy door shut. But as the latch clicked, I realized I didn't have my key card. I was locked in, but I wasn't alone. A small secondary monitor I had never noticed before flickered to life in the corner of the ceiling. It showed the inside of the safe room from a top-down angle, and as I watched my own image on the screen, I saw a door behind the shelving unit that wasn't there in real life. I moved the boxes of water, my hands shaking, and found not a door but a viewing pane of one-way glass. Looking through it, I saw a second room, identical to the one I was in, but filled with dozens of monitors, all showing me at different stages of my life. There were photos of me as a child, my college graduation, my first job, all pinned to the walls with meticulous care. He told me that the world outside had finally become too dangerous, that the person I saw on the monitors in the yard was the one they wanted, and that as long as I stayed in the box, I was a secret that couldn't be told. He said he had built this place to keep the memory of me pure, away from the friction of reality. I looked at the camera lens, the tiny black eye that had been watching me for months, and I realized the break-ins he talked about weren't happening to other people. They were his way of explaining the things he was taking from me. My keys, my car, my autonomy, my sense of what was real. I sat on the floor, the grey foam of the soundproofing absorbing the sound of my breathing until it felt like I was already a ghost. The LED lights dimmed to a soft twilight purple, and the ventilation system began its rhythmic hum, 3 long beats and 2 short ones, a coded message I would never understand. I am safe. I am secure. I am forgotten. I am still here, in the room that isn't a room, waiting for the next update. Betrayal is a debt that always gets paid in full. Subscribe now to see the debt collected in part 2. Drop a fire emoji in the comments if you think he deserves what's coming, and share this with a friend who loves a good villain downfall. I haven't seen the sun in 14 days, but the LED strip in the ceiling says it's exactly 3 RPM, a sterile white light that makes the grey foam on the walls look like the skin of something long dead. Mark's voice hasn't come through the intercom for several hours, yet the air in here feels crowded, thick with the weight of being watched by the lenses I still haven't found. The revenge began not with a scream, but with a silent realization while I was tracing that jagged scratch near the base of the steel door. The one he claimed was from a previous owner we never actually had. My fingernail caught on a tiny metallic burr, and as I pressed down, a thin sliver of the reinforced steel flaked away like dry skin to reveal a layer of common plywood painted with industrial grey primer. The entire room, this fortress he spent months building to protect me, was a psychological illusion, a stage set designed to hold me not through physical strength, but through the belief that I was helpless behind an impenetrable barrier. The weight of his betrayal shifted in my chest, turning from a cold dread into a low buzzing heat that cleared the lethargy from my limbs. I realized that if the door was a lie, then the rules were lies too, and the danger outside was just a narrative he fed me to keep me from testing the handle. I sat back on the cot, my breathing shallow and rhythmic, making sure to keep my face turned toward the primary camera so the image on his monitor would remain one of a broken, submissive captive. Every few minutes, I would let my shoulders slump a little further, a carefully choreographed descent into despair that I knew he was recording, likely filing it away in that second room I saw through the viewing pane. But beneath the cot, out of the camera's narrow field of vision, my fingers were working at the seam of the floor tiles. I found that the industrial adhesive he used was only applied to the edges, a shortcut that allowed me to lift a single square of linoleum without a sound. Beneath it wasn't a concrete foundation, but a hollow space filled with cables, the nervous system of his surveillance empire. I started to learn the language of the wires, tracing them back to the power supply he'd told me was independent and unreachable. There was a yellow wire that hummed with a different frequency than the others, and when I pressed my ear to the floor, I could hear the faint, distorted echo of his footsteps in the house above. He was pacing in the kitchen, the rhythmic thud-thud of his boots a metronome for my planning. I decided to use his own patterns against him. For months, he had been conditioning me to react to the 3 long beats and 2 short beats of the ventilation system, a signal that meant a meal was coming or that he was about to speak. I began to mimic that rhythm in my own movements, walking across the room in that exact sequence, tapping my glass on the shelf in that exact timing. On the monitors in his secret room, I must have looked like I was finally breaking, adopting the vessel behavior he had been whispering about to the darkness. I wanted him to feel a sense of completion, a pride in his handiwork that would make him overconfident. The first discovery that truly changed the game happened when I found a discarded internal memo from a security firm tucked inside one of the canned water crates, a piece of paper he must have dropped during the construction. It wasn't about home defense. It was an invoice for psychological containment units and behavioral feedback loops. The company didn't exist in the real world, but the logo was a stylized eye that matched a ring I'd seen him wear on his pinky for years. I wasn't just his wife being kept safe. I was an asset in a larger experiment, a data point in a study of how long a human spirit can survive in a box of its own fears. That was when I stopped trying to escape and started trying to take over the experiment. I realized the ventilation duct wasn't just for air. It was a physical connection to the rest of the house, a narrow throat that carried sound both ways. I began to whisper back into the vent during the hours I knew he was sleeping, using the same calm, clinical tone he used on me. I didn't say anything threatening. I simply repeated the coordinates and dates I had heard him recite in the kitchen, turning his own ledger into a haunting loop that drifted up into his bedroom. I wanted him to question if the safety of the house was leaking, if the silence he worked so hard to maintain was being corrupted by the very thing he'd locked away. The escalation was subtle. I noticed his pacing above me began to falter, the rhythm of his footsteps losing its steady beat. He started checking the intercom more often, his voice crackling with a new edge of static as he asked if I had heard anything unusual in the walls. I would just smile at the camera, a slow, empty expression that told him nothing and everything. I started moving the furniture in the room by inches every night, a slight shift that wouldn't be obvious at first glance, but would create a sense of wrongness in the peripheral vision of someone staring at a monitor for 12 hours a day. The chair was 2 inches to the left, the shelves were slightly tilted, the cot was angled toward the door. I was gaslighting the man who had built a cage out of gaslight. The turning point came when I found the override. Tucked behind the primary camera housing, accessible only if I stood on the very edge of the shelving unit and reached into a gap in the foam, was a manual reset button for the safe room environment. He had kept it there as a failsafe in case the software crashed, assuming I would never be bold enough to look behind the eye that watched me. I didn't press it. Not yet. I waited until I heard him enter the secret viewing room, the faint click of the hidden door behind the shelving unit signaling his arrival. I knew he was sitting in that chair with my yellow sweater, bathed in the blue light of my life's history, watching the screen for any sign of the vessel cracking. I stood in the center of the room and looked directly into the lens, not with fear, but with a terrifying, absolute recognition. I began to speak, my voice a low melodic drone that mimicked the hum of the ventilation. I told him about the plywood under the primer. I told him about the yellow wire under the floor. I told him about the memo and the stylized eye. I watched the tally light on the camera flicker, as his hand must have shaken on the controls. I told him that a cage only works if the bird doesn't know it can peck through the bars, and that I had been pecking for a long time. Then I reached up and pressed the reset button. The room didn't open. Instead, the lights went out, plunging me into a darkness so thick it felt like physical pressure. But in that darkness, the true nature of the house was revealed. The walls weren't just plywood and foam, they were translucent when the internal LEDs were killed and the external lights were left on. I could see the silhouette of the hallway, the kitchen, and most importantly, the secret room right next to me. Mark was standing on the other side of the glass, his face pressed against it, his eyes wide and vacant as he realized the one-way mirror had become a window for both of us. He looked small. He looked fragile. He looked like a man who had built a fortress to hide from the very thing he had become. I didn't try to break the glass. I just stood there inches away from him, separated by a thin layer of lies, and I watched him realize that he was the one who was trapped. He had spent so much time monitoring my patterns that he had neglected his own, and now the outside world he had warned me about was just the rest of the house that he could no longer control. The power to the locks was tied to the same system I had just reset, and I heard the heavy bolts in the kitchen and the front door slide home, sealing the entire house from the inside. He had programmed the house to go into total sanctuary mode if the safe room was compromised, a protocol designed to protect the asset at all costs. But the asset was me, and the threat was now officially identified as him. The automated security system, governed by the very rules he had programmed, began to treat his presence in the viewing room as an intrusion. I watched through the glass as the red emergency lights in his room began to pulse, a rhythmic, accusing glare. The ventilation in his section began to hiss with a heavy, sweet-smelling gas, the same sedative he'd been using on me in small doses to keep me lethargic. He pounded on the glass, his mouth moving in a silent plea, but the soundproofing he was so proud of worked perfectly. I stood in the cool, dark safety of my cage and watched him slide down the wall, his eyes never leaving mine until they finally drifted shut. The house is quiet now, a silence that feels earned rather than forced. I know how to navigate the wires under the floor, and I know which sequence of taps on the wall will eventually trigger the manual release for the plywood door. But for now, I'm content to wait. I can see him through the glass, a slumped figure in a room full of screens that are now all showing static. The experiment is over, and the data has been collected. I find myself wondering if there are other houses on this street with dead spaces between the walls, other women wearing yellow sweaters who are currently being told that the air outside is toxic. I think about the stylized eye and the invoice that shouldn't exist, and I realize that while I've taken control of this cage, the forest is still full of shadows. I'll leave soon, stepping out into the neighborhood he told me was a wasteland, and I'll walk until I find the sun. But I'll keep the keycard in my purse, a cold, heavy reminder that safety is a story we tell ourselves until we find a better one. I am safe. I am secure. I am the one who watches.